They buried him 3 times. Each time by morning the earth had been moved, and the child was breathing again. Before we continue, take a breath. The past is closer than you think. Subscribe to remember what others forgot. The year was 1862, and Mississippi lay under the weight of its own sins. The land was thick with the scent of magnolia and blood, its fields whispering with the echoes of chains and prayers. Near the quiet town of Vicksburg, where the river bent like a crooked finger, stood the Crowther plantation, a sprawling ruin of wealth and cruelty. Its owner, Silas Crowther, was a man both feared and pitied. Feared, for his temper could fell a man faster than a bullet. Pitied, because madness had begun to eat away at him since the death of his wife. Or perhaps she had not died at all. The whispers differed depending on who you asked. Among the slave quarters they spoke of her ghost, how she was seen walking through the cornfields under a blood moon, calling softly for a child no one had ever seen. Silas had purchased many souls, but one in particular would damn him forever. In early spring, when the war was clawing through the South like a fever, a small boy arrived at the Crowther plantation. He was no older than 8. The auctioneer claimed he had been found alive beneath the rubble of a burned house. His mother, a slave woman, dead beside him. They said he hadn't made a sound even as the flames closed around him. That silence made Silas by him. The boy's name, as far as anyone knew, was Elias. He had the strange pale eyes of a storm, the kind that caught the moonlight wrong. When he first stepped onto the plantation, every dog began to howl, and every lantern flickered out. "He won't last the night," one of the field hands whispered. But Elias did. He lasted many nights, and soon the overseers began to notice things. He never seemed to eat much. He didn't sleep either, at least no one ever caught him lying still. The other children said they saw him walking the fields at dawn, bare feet on cold soil, whispering to the ground as if it would answer back. Silas took to watching him from the window of his study, a glass of whiskey in his trembling hand. There was something about that boy that stirred a buried part of him, a memory he didn't want to face. One night, when thunder broke across the hills, Silas heard humming, a lullaby faint and hollow. He followed the sound out toward the slave quarters, rain pelting the earth, his lantern trembling. There, under the old oak that had seen more death than most battlefields, Elias stood barefoot in the mud. He was humming the same song Silas's wife used to sing. Silas froze. His wife, Margaret, had sung that lullaby only to one person, to the stillborn son buried years ago beneath that very tree. Silas shouted, demanding where the boy had heard it, but Elias only stared at him, unblinking, rain sliding down his face. "She taught me," he said softly. "Your lady." Silas struck him, hard enough to knock him to the ground. But the boy did not cry. He only looked up, and in his pale eyes, Silas saw the reflection of the oak's shadow bending like a man's neck snapping. By morning, Silas ordered the boy to be sent to the fields. "Work him until he breaks," he told the overseer. But Elias didn't break. If anything, the earth seemed to work with him. The plows glided smoother, the animals quieted when he passed. Even the crops near him grew taller. One of the women, old Mary, began to whisper that Elias carried a spirit inside him. "Not a ghost," she told the others. "A reckoning." The word spread quietly through the quarters. Reckoning. But in the manor, Silas grew sicker. He started seeing shadows in the mirrors. Heard footsteps in the hall outside his room. Once, when he was drunk enough to admit it, he told his overseer that the boy's humming followed him into his dreams. "He sings like he's waiting," Silas muttered. "Waiting for someone to die." The overseer laughed. "He's just a child, sir." But that night, the overseer's horse was found torn apart at the edge of the field, its body untouched by knife or beast, its eyes wide open as if it had seen something unspeakable. Elias was found sitting near it, hands folded neatly in his lap. "He just stared at me," said one of the men. "Didn't say a word." The overseer wanted to whip him, but when he raised his hand, the whip turned on itself, curling like it had caught the wind. The overseer's arm broke clean in two. The sound echoed through the plantation like a gunshot. From that day on, no one dared touch the boy. Not even Silas. But Silas could feel the walls closing in. His fields were dying, his men were deserting, and the war was creeping closer. He began locking himself in his study, surrounded by empty bottles and fading candlelight. The boy's presence had begun to twist something deep inside him, something darker than fear. Guilt. He started to remember things he had buried beneath the whiskey and the wealth. The cries of a woman. The sight of his own hands around a throat. Margaret's eyes as she whispered, "You'll pay for this." But Elias's eyes followed him everywhere, like a living echo of the curse. And then, one stormy night, Silas found the grave beneath the oak tree disturbed. The soil was fresh as if someone had been digging. He didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning Elias was gone. Or perhaps, as some would later whisper, he had simply gone back to where he came from. Yet, as the dawn broke and the fog rolled over the fields, Silas heard humming again. This time it came from beneath the floorboards of his study. He pressed his ear to the ground, and for the first time since the war began, Silas Crowther screamed. The sound carried all the way to the quarters. No one went to the house for hours. When they did, Silas was gone. Only the sound of a lullaby lingered in the air. And in the corner of the room, etched into the wood with small, shaking hands, were 3 words: "I'm still here." The Crowther plantation would never recover from that night. But the story of the child who refused to die had only begun to spread. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Vicksburg claimed they sometimes saw a small figure walking the fields at dawn, humming softly, the mist curling around him like breath. And if you followed the sound too closely, they said the ground beneath your feet might start to move. By the time spring bled into the heat of June, whispers began to stir among the quarters and the nearby town of Natchez. They said the child who should have been dead was now walking, silent, barefoot, and pale as wax in the moonlight. Those who saw him spoke in broken voices, unsure if what they'd witnessed was a child or a shadow wearing his shape. In the plantation house, Mrs. Evelyn Hartfield no longer slept. The wife of the late Dr. Samuel Hartfield had buried the slave woman and her newborn after the fever took them both. Yet every night since, the same sound came from the garden, an infant's cry that started low, then rose until it seemed to rattle the glass of her windows. She tried to dismiss it as wind, as foxes, as grief finding a voice, but she knew better. The earth in her orchard had not settled right. It was as if the ground itself refused to hold what she'd hidden there. The plantation had once been a place of controlled order, polished silver, hymn songs at dusk, laughter echoing through the long halls. But since that burial the air had soured. Lamps flickered though oil was fresh. The clock stopped at midnight. And one by one servants began to leave. A boy named Caleb, no older than 12, was the first to vanish. He had been the one ordered to dig the shallow grave. When asked what he'd seen, he said only, "The baby opened its eyes." The next morning his cot was empty. No footprints. No struggle. Just gone. Down by the slave quarters the elders whispered about the mark. Some claimed the mother had been cursed. She'd conceived the child not from love, but from violence. And such blood, once spilled, never stayed buried. They said the boy's soul didn't know where to belong, half innocent, half vengeance. The preacher came from town, clutching his worn Bible like a weapon. He told Evelyn that such talk was the devil's work, that faith could cleanse fear. But when he passed the burial plot, his hand trembled. He left before dusk, mumbling that some graves breathed wrong. At the edge of the property, Dr. Amos Whitby arrived a week later, a friend of her late husband, curious about the rumor of a child who would not die. He came not with prayers but with curiosity. "Nature plays tricks," he said, "especially where guilt lingers." That night the two of them stood by the garden. The moon hung heavy and orange and the soil looked bruised. Evelyn pointed to the mound. "There," she whispered, "it moves sometimes." Dr. Whitby knelt, candle trembling in his hand. For a long moment there was nothing. Only the hum of insects and the rustle of cypress leaves. Then, faintly from beneath the earth, a sigh. He drew back, breath caught in his throat. "Perhaps gases," he said, voice cracking. "From decay." But Evelyn shook her head. "Decay doesn't breathe." The next morning she ordered the grave exhumed. The servants refused. Not one would go near it. So she and Dr. Whitby took shovels themselves, the heat pressing down like punishment. The soil came away too easily, damp and soft. And when they reached the small wooden box, it was empty. Not stolen. Not disturbed. Simply hollow. Evelyn collapsed to her knees. Whitby stared, pale and rigid. In the mud beside the coffin, a trail of small footprints led away into the trees. That night something changed in Evelyn. Fear gave way to obsession. She had the servants light lanterns along every path. She left milk by the door, bread on the steps, offerings, she told herself, to calm the spirit. But the more she gave, the closer it came. The soft patter of steps across the porch. The creak of the nursery door she'd locked years ago. Sometimes she woke to find tiny handprints on the window glass, too high for any child to reach. Dr. Whitby documented everything in a leather-bound journal, his scientific detachment fraying with each entry. He wrote of sightings at dawn, A figure near the orchard, small, naked, moving strangely, almost weightless. He wrote of animals found dead without wounds. He wrote of hearing breathing in rooms that were empty. Soon, Evelyn stopped leaving her chamber. She sat before the fire, staring into the flames, her mind circling the same thought. If the child had lived, where had he gone? And if he had not, what, then, was walking beneath her roof? The townsfolk avoided the Hartfield estate now. The postman refused to deliver letters after dusk. Even the church bell, once heard across the valley, began to rust from disuse. The night of the harvest moon, when light turned the field silver, Evelyn heard a knock at her door. 3 soft raps, childlike. When she opened it, there was no one. Only a trail of wet footprints leading toward the stairs. She followed them, candle in hand, each step echoing against the wood. The prints led her to the nursery, the one she had sealed after the mother's death. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of earth and milk. The cradle rocked on its own. And upon the pillow lay a tiny lock of black hair, fresh, damp, and real. Evelyn sank to her knees. Her candle flickered out. In the dark, something shifted behind her. A child's breath, soft and close. Then silence. Only the creak of the cradle kept time with her heartbeat. The next morning, Dr. Whitby found the room empty. No Evelyn. No footprints. No sound. Just the cradle, still rocking gently in the morning light. The journal closed that day with one final line written in his trembling hand. The dead do not always stay where we leave them. Dr. Amos Whitby remained on the Hartfield plantation longer than he intended. He had come as a man of science, but each night that passed stripped another layer of reason from him. The servants were gone. The house had turned inward, creaking like an old coffin. And Evelyn Hartfield, once poised, composed, was nowhere to be found. Her absence hung over every hallway like a presence that hadn't truly left. The doctor began to hear things. The soft thump of footsteps above him when no one walked the upper floors. The faintest laughter, echoing down the stairwell at midnight. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself the wind through the shutters could sound like voices. Yet every morning the same thing appeared on his desk, a small muddy footprint the size of a child's. One evening, as the rain lashed the windows, he decided to descend into the cellar. He hadn't gone there since the day he arrived. It reeked of mold and iron. Carrying a lantern, he moved carefully down the narrow stairs. The smell grew stronger with each step, metallic, unmistakable. At the base of the stairs, the lantern light flickered across the stone wall, and there it was, a stain dark and wide, spreading upward like a bloom. He touched it. It was still wet. And beneath it, carved into the brick, were words he could barely read. Born twice. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. The lantern dropped, flames licking at the damp floor. As he knelt to smother it, a sound rose from deeper in the cellar, a shuffling, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice trembling. The sound stopped. Then a whisper, small, breathy, right beside his ear. "Mama." He turned, swinging the lantern wildly. Empty air. But the whisper came again, now from behind him. Then above him. Then from everywhere. He ran up the stairs, stumbling through the dark, nearly breaking the lantern glass. When he reached the main hall, he found the door to the nursery open again. The air pouring from it was freezing cold. Dr. Whitby crept closer. Inside, moonlight spilled across the floorboards, illuminating something he could not at first understand. A figure sitting in the corner, knees drawn to chest, humming. It was Evelyn. Or what remained of her. Her dress was torn, her hands filthy with soil. She rocked back and forth, whispering a lullaby to something she held in her arms. "Evelyn," he said softly. She looked up. Her eyes were wide and glassy. "He came back," she whispered. "He's so small. So cold. He just wanted his mother." She lifted what she was holding. In her arms was not a living child, but a bundle of rags and hair matted with dirt. A shape of something that once resembled a baby. Yet as Whitby stared, he saw it move, its chest rising once, faintly, like a sigh. He staggered backward. "That's impossible." Evelyn smiled, her teeth pale in the dark. "You said that before." He fled the room. The sound of her lullaby followed him through the halls until he slammed his chamber door shut. He could still hear the creak of the cradle, the soft whisper of breathing in the walls. That night, he wrote everything he could remember into his journal, desperate to anchor his mind to reason. But the more he wrote, the less the words made sense. They curved and bled into each other, letters rearranging themselves as if written by another hand. When he looked down, the ink had turned the color of rust. Days passed, though he could no longer tell one from the next. He ate little, slept less. The house seemed to breathe around him, walls expanding, contracting. Sometimes he would hear the front door creak open, footsteps cross the parlor, then nothing. On the 7th night after Evelyn's disappearance, Whitby decided to leave. He packed his notes, his lantern, and what remained of his courage. But as he reached the main hall, the grandfather clock, stopped for weeks, suddenly began to tick. Each sound louder, sharper, almost human in rhythm. He froze. A whisper drifted through the hall, faint but clear, "You can't leave him." The nursery door creaked open on its own. Inside, moonlight pooled across the cradle. It rocked gently as though something unseen had just stepped away. And beside it, Evelyn's shawl, folded neatly, her wedding ring resting on top. Dr. Whitby approached slowly, drawn by something he couldn't name. When he reached for the cradle, a cold gust extinguished his lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. Then came the sound again, soft breathing inches from his ear. He turned, eyes wide, trying to see through the blackness. "Who's there?" he whispered. The reply came, faint and childlike, "You buried me." And in that instant his heart stopped. Not from a blow but from recognition. He remembered the mother, the young woman he and Samuel Hartfield had forced back to work too soon after childbirth. He remembered her pleading, her fever, her final words, asterisk, "If he dies, so do you." Asterisk. The lantern flared back to life without warning. The cradle was empty. But on the floor before it, a second set of footprints had appeared, tiny ones wet with fresh mud, leading away from the room. He followed them through the hall, down the stairs and out into the yard where the night air pressed thick with mist. The prints led him to the same patch of earth Evelyn had disturbed weeks before. The grave was open again. At the bottom lay the wooden coffin, split, hollow and breathing. Dr. Whitby fell to his knees, unable to move, unable to scream. He could see something shifting inside the box, the faintest pulse beneath the soil. He leaned closer, drawn by terror or fascination. And then, from beneath the dirt, a hand reached out and touched his face, small, cold, and alive. He never made it back to the house. When the sun rose the next morning, the fields were still. The front door of the Hartfield estate swung open in the breeze, and the doctor's journal lay on the porch, its pages soaked through with rain and something darker. The last line written in his hand read, "The child breathes still." By the time anyone found the Hartfield plantation again, it was already sinking into silence. A drifter passing through the marshland saw the smoke first, thin, gray, almost deliberate. He followed it to where the house once stood proud, now half consumed by ivy and rot. The windows gaped open like hollow eyes. No one answered when he called. The front steps were damp with footprints that led nowhere. They said the house had been cursed long before that night. That Evelyn Hartfield's family built it upon graves no one dared to mark. But what the drifter found in the parlor became the final piece of a legend that still circles through Mississippi towns when the nights grow long and the fog rolls deep over the bayous. He found a cradle. Perfectly clean. Empty save for a lock of pale hair. And beside it, an old journal, pages wrinkled with water, ink bleeding at the edges. The first words he could still make out were written in a hurried scrawl. "He's still breathing." The drifter didn't stay. He ran until the house disappeared behind the cypress trees, until the road met the river and the mist swallowed all signs of where he'd been. By the time he reached the nearest town, the story had already begun to shift, like every story that passes through too many frightened lips. They said a doctor went mad inside that house. That he tried to raise the dead. That he made a pact with a grieving mother to bring back her stillborn child. Some said he succeeded. Others whispered that he hadn't resurrected a child at all, but something else, something that only looked like one. The locals avoided the plantation afterward. The crops around it never grew again. Livestock that wandered too close were found days later with their throats torn open, though there were no wolves for miles. At night, hunters swore they could hear the faint sound of crying drifting across the fields. Not a human cry, but something softer, hollow, like wind through a flute. Years later, a new family bought the land. They tore down what remained of the Hartfield home and built a smaller house nearby, closer to the river. The father, a practical man, refused to believe in curses. Yet on the first night after moving in, his wife woke him with a start. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. He didn't at first. Then came the faintest sound, a child humming somewhere near the window. When he opened the shutters, no one was there. Just the mist, rolling thick and low, and a single muddy footprint on the sill. The next morning they found their infant daughter asleep in her crib, unharmed, but her tiny hands were stained brown as if she'd been playing in the dirt. By the end of that week, the family packed and left. The house fell silent again, reclaimed by the land that had always wanted it back. Locals who dared to venture near the ruins said the air felt different there, heavy, unmoving. Some claimed to see candlelight flicker behind windows long gone. Others swore they saw a woman standing near the broken gate, holding something wrapped in white linen. And once, in 1912, a surveyor mapping the property dug into the soil near where the grave had been. His spade struck wood. Beneath it he found not one coffin but two, one large, one small. The larger was splintered and empty. The smaller was intact, its lid sealed tight. When the surveyor pried it open, he saw the tiny body of a child perfectly preserved, eyes half open, mouth frozen in something that looked disturbingly like a smile. The sheriff ordered the site resealed. But by morning both coffins were gone. Today the locals call it the breathing grave. They say if you walk by that land when the fog rises, you'll hear three sounds: the creak of a cradle, the rustle of a doctor's coat, and a soft voice whispering "Mama." No one stays there past sundown. Even the animals keep their distance. What remains of the Hartfield estate lies buried beneath moss and memory, its name erased from every record except one: the final page of Dr. Amos Whitby's journal, now kept in a locked drawer at the county museum. Visitors say the ink still looks wet. And if you listen closely enough when you stand beside the display, you might swear you hear a heartbeat. Because some stories don't end, they just keep breathing. If this story found you tonight, let it rest with a like, and wake again with a subscribe.